The hospital room was silent, except for the faint beeping of a heart monitor and the wheezing breaths of an old man who had seen more battles than most could imagine. 94-year-old Sergeant Frank Dawson, a decorated Marine veteran, lay frail but proud in his bed, the kind of man whose handshake still carried the weight of history. Then, slap! Echoed through the sterile room. Everyone froze. The nurse, her face flushed with anger, stood over the old Marine, her hand trembling. In that same instant, 15 leather-clad Hell's Angels, massive men with tattoos, vests, and piercing stares, rose from their seats in the waiting area outside. The leader, a giant of a man with a grey beard and eyes full of fire, whispered, "But she just hit Frank, that's when everything changed." Frank Dawson was no ordinary patient. He was a legend, a Marine who had fought in Iwo Jima, a man who'd carried 3 wounded comrades through enemy fire, and someone who never once bragged about it. After the war, he lived a quiet life as a mechanic in a small town. Everyone who met him said he carried himself with a dignity that could humble anyone. But time has no mercy, and at 94 Frank was losing his strength. He had no family left, no children, no wife. Yet somehow he was never alone. That's because a group of bikers, that Hell's Angels had sent, had adopted him as their own. Years earlier, one of the bikers, a man named Big Mike, had broken down outside Frank's home. The old Marine helped him fix his Harley for free, refusing payment. When Mike found out who Frank was, a Medal of Honor recipient, he promised, "You ever need anything, old man, call me. The Angels got your back." And that day, Frank became something of a legend in their world. The Marine, they called him. Visited him weekly, cleaned his yard, brought him food, and even took him to veterans' gatherings on their bikes, letting him feel the wind again. So when Frank was admitted to the hospital for pneumonia, they took shifts visiting. They made sure he had company, laughter, and dignity. But not everyone appreciated that. Some nurses didn't like the sight of the Angels, their leather vests, their tattoos, their loud voices. To them, they were troublemakers. To Frank, they were family. That's when a Nurse Collins came into the picture. She was strict and impatient. She saw Frank as just another bed number, not a man who had once bled for her freedom. And on that fateful morning, when Frank accidentally spilled his water, she snapped. "Can't you do anything right?" she hissed, grabbing his wrist roughly. Frank looked at her with quiet dignity and whispered, "Oh, ma'am, I've been through worse than this." Her hand struck his face before she could even think. The sound of that slap was enough to silence the hallway and awaken the storm. Within seconds, the 15 Hell's Angels who had been sitting outside his room burst through the door. Their boots thundered against the floor as they surrounded the nurse. Big Mike's voice rumbled low. "You just hit a U.S. Marine. You better start praying." The nurse turned pale. Fear flooded her eyes. But before anything could happen, Frank raised a trembling hand and said softly, "Stand down, boys." Even the Angels froze. The hospital fell into chaos. Security was called, doctors rushed in. But in that moment, all that mattered was the old Marine sitting there with tears in his eyes, not from pain but from disappointment. He looked at the nurse and said, "I fought for this country so people like you could live free. I didn't fight for you to fear me. I fought for you to learn compassion." The nurse broke down crying, realizing what she had done. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked under guilt. The Angels wanted to tear the place apart, but Frank wouldn't allow it. "Mike," he said quietly, "you told me once that respect is earned, not forced. Let's earn it today."
The words stopped everyone.
The bikers slowly stepped back, watching as Frank asked the nurse to come closer. She hesitated, then knelt by his bed. "Do you know why that hurt more than the slap?" he asked gently. "Because I've seen men die trying to protect others, and I never thought I'd see someone in your position forget what mercy means." She sobbed uncontrollably, whispering, "I'm so sorry." And Frank placed a shaking hand on hers and said, "And then prove it. Be better." "That's all I ask." When the hospital administrators arrived, they found a shocking scene. 15 Hell's Angels standing in silence, heads bowed, while a nurse cried beside a Marine's bed. No violence, no threats, just respect. Word spread quickly. The next morning, the hospital was flooded with messages of gratitude for Frank. Veterans, bikers, nurses, and even strangers came to see him, each moved by his forgiveness. A week later, Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep. But on the day of his funeral, something unforgettable happened. Over 300 Hells Angels en route in formation behind the hearse, their engines roaring like a salute from the heavens. And walking among them was Nurse Collins, holding a folded American flag, tears in her eyes. She'd taken a vow to dedicate the rest of her life to serving veterans in Frank's memory. Big Mike stood at the graveside and said, "He taught us that real strength isn't in fists or engines, it's in forgiveness." The camera fades out on the flag rippling in the wind, the engines rumbling in unison, and a single quote from Frank Dawson's diary appearing on screen. "And courage isn't the absence of anger, it's the power to forgive when you could destroy." And this story reminds us that true power doesn't come from muscles or revenge. It comes from an honor, compassion, and forgiveness. Even in the face of injustice, a single act of mercy can transform hearts and leave a legacy stronger than any battle ever fought.